Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. During the weekend, Russia has unleashed its largest aerial attack on Ukraine since the start of the war, killing civilians and striking Kyiv's government buildings. With peace talks stalled and both sides refusing to compromise, attention is again shifting from diplomacy to economic pressure. The question now, what tougher measures can the West take to force Moscow to change course? Well, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Weeks have passed since Donald Trump's meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, and there is no sign of another meeting being imminent. For all intents and purposes, it seems that the matter of peace talks around the war in Ukraine have stalled. Given these circumstances, Western leaders, including the American president, have been increasingly vocal on the subject of sanctions. The European Commission plans to present a 19th package of sanctions against Russia later this week.
We will impose additional sanctions in conjunction with the United States of America and provide clear responses to this refusal to move forward. This is also what President Trump expressed earlier during this call.
Adopting new measures is crucial as Russia has not only shown unwillingness to come to the negotiating table, but has also intensified its attacks against Ukraine. It recently launched its largest airstrike against the country. New economic sanctions will have to hit Moscow where it hurts, for example its oil industry, if they are to put a dent in Russian military production.
This will not stop until we work together to ensure that Russia can no longer wage this war, at least for economic reasons, perhaps also for military reasons, but in any case for economic reasons.
For now, the hitherto adopted sanctions have had an impact on the Russian economy, but it has been much less of a hindrance than expected. As Russia has been able to divert a lot of its trade to other countries, more will have to be done beyond merely slapping extra restrictions on Russian export and punishing the country's oligarchs.
And now let's zone in on the east-planning portion of our show. Ever since Russian tanks rolled over the Ukrainian border in February 2022, Western powers have bombarded the Russian Federation with sanctions. Their aim was to cripple the Russian economy and hinder the country's ability to wage war, yet their effectiveness have been disputed.
Those who have felt the bite of the sanctions the most are ordinary Russians. The country's economy is grappling with growing inflation, which has hit the pockets of millions of Russians, who often find themselves struggling to make ends meet. Russian authorities are reportedly cracking down on food producers over the rapid growth of consumer prices, but the general public has become more concerned with prices than they are with the war in Ukraine itself. On a broader level, the Russian economy's growth has been slowing down, and experts have been warning about the dire consequences of stagnation. These warnings, however, have reportedly been dismissed by the Kremlin, which claims that Western sanctions have turned out to be a net positive because they have led Russia to seek new opportunities. While it is true that Moscow has diversified its trading partners, countries like China and India are still struggling to fill in all the gaps left by the departure of Western companies and the suspended access to Western markets.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Russia has just launched its largest aerial assault on Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. Over 800 drones and missiles striking Kyiv and other cities, killing civilians and damaging government buildings. The attack came only days after President Zelensky dismissed Vladimir Putin's demand to hold peace talks in Moscow, saying he could not negotiate in the capital of a nation still bombing its people. With peace efforts at a standstill, the focus is shifting to economic warfare, how the West can tighten the screws on Russia's finances. President Trump has hinted that new sanctions could be imminent. Treasury officials say that if the United States and Europe coordinate tougher measures, including secondary sanctions on countries helping Moscow sell oil, Russia's economy could be pushed into collapse. Moscow, however, has proven more durable than expected. Years of so-called Fortress Russia policies gave Putin large reserves and a cushion against sanction. Yet, those buffers are weakening. Inflation is high, growth is slowing, and social costs are rising. That's where the West has untapped leverage. More than $300 billion in Russian central bank assets remain frozen in Western jurisdictions. Seizing and redirecting those funds to Ukraine's defense could change the equation dramatically. Beyond state assets, oligarchs like Roman Abramovich remains under investigation, with courts in Europe moving to expose hidden wealth. Targeting these networks, yachts, trusts, and offshore accounts would further drain the Kremlin's war chest. Europe is already discussing a 19th sanction package, from tightening controls on oil tankers to restricting Russian diplomats and travel. The message from experts is clear. enforcing existing sanctions, go harder on the shadow economy, and use Russia's frozen wealth for Ukraine. Only then, they say, will Putin feel real pressure to reconsider war over peace. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Antonios Tzanakopoulos, Professor of Public International Law from the University of Oxford. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So today we are examining some of the legal actions could be taken against Russia for its war against Ukraine. Now, ever since the beginning of the war, a lot of talks are about increasing sanctions as well as utilizing Russian frozen assets. But I do have the slight suspicion that the fact it's being drawn out for so long without a lot of concrete action, especially when it comes to frozen Russian assets, probably have some legal hurdles or logistic issues behind it. Can you help us unpack why is it so difficult to actually utilize these assets?
Yes, I think I can. So essentially, when we're talking about sanctions, is the term you used, in the case of states acting against other states in circumstances like the ones we have in Russia, what we're talking about in the technical language of international law is either countermeasures or retortions. So countermeasures are illegal acts in response to illegal acts. And retortions are unfriendly acts that can be taken at any time. To give you an example, withdrawing your diplomats from another state or withdrawing voluntary aid is an act of retortion that can be taken at any time, but it has been taken, for example, against Russia in response to the invasion of Ukraine. And then acts of retortion and, countermeasures are acts like the proper sanctions that we talk about, like, for example, freezing another state's assets that are in your territory, within your jurisdiction. That would normally be illegal, but it is allowed in the circumstances because it's in response to an unlawful act. So freezing assets is something that can be done, but utilizing these frozen assets just goes beyond what is normally allowed when taking countermeasures. So finally disposing those assets, taking, let's say, the frozen Russian assets and using them to compensate Ukraine or to assist Ukraine would actually make the measure non-reversible, non-temporary. And countermeasures, so the sanctions that we're talking about, need to be reversible and temporary. This is because the idea of these measures is to make the state against which they are taken return to legality. So if they cannot be reversed, they cannot have the objective of pushing that state to return to legality. They have the objective of punishing the state, and that's not allowed.
All right. Now, some experts are drawing to some similarities when it comes to Iran's invasion of Kuwait, and some similar actions were taken back then. Can you help us differentiate what's the difference between the two?
Oh, yeah, there's a big difference. So if you're talking about the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in 1990 and then the reaction in 1990, 1991, these reactions were taken by the United Nations on the basis of decisions of the Security Council. Of course, the United Nations Charter gives the United Nations, through the Security Council, enormous power to take measures that are binding on all member states of the UN. That basically means that there's all sorts of things that you can do in those circumstances, including using force in the name of the United Nations, which you cannot do when you're acting unilaterally or even multilaterally. That means if we don't have a decision of the UN Security Council under Chapter 7 of the Charter, as we don't in this situation, every state needs to decide for itself what measures it is going to take and on what legal basis. And that then means that there are certain states that have taken sanctions against Russia, whereas there are other states that have decided not to take measures against Russia, as is their right. This is, of course, because Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, so it can and it has blocked any Security Council decision with respect to Ukraine. So essentially, the difference is it's one thing to be acting through the UN, where the powers are much more significant, and it's another thing for each state to be acting unilaterally without the basis of a Security Council decision. Of course, the issue here is that we cannot have a Security Council decision against Russia. The organization was constructed in this way so that if one of the 5 permanent members disagreed, the Security Council would not be able to act, and Russia is a permanent member.
Right, and with Russia being a permanent member of the UN, it does seem like it's impossible. But do you think there's any other kind of larger bodies that could grant EU countries these power, be it the European Union or any other organizations?
Well, effectively, the European Union, no, there's no other organization that can sort of step in for the UN. Let's just put it this way. So that extreme, enormous power of the UN, no other organization can emulate. But what the EU can do is to have the 27 member states act in concert. That means one decision at EU level can then obligate the 27 member states to all adopt the same measures, which is something that the EU has done. It hasn't done it just with respect to Russia. It has done it in other cases in the past, but it has already done in this case. So this is already a significant way to organize and correlate those measures so that 27 states are acting in concert. That can be much more powerful than each of the 27 member states taking different decisions as to whether they're going to sanction Russia and with respect to what. So that already sort of goes some way towards helping in this respect, but there's nothing more that the EU can do. So there's no way for the EU to force other states other than the 27, to also adopt sanctions. What all it can do is it can lobby states to consider adopting sanctions. I think much of the issue that we see here is that whereas the EU, the United States, certain other states, Singapore, Japan, have taken measures against Russia in these circumstances, there are quite a few very powerful states that have not done so, including, for example, China or India and so on. So there is no way for the EU, which essentially is a third actor in this situation, to somehow impose something like this on Russia or on China or India. The only way would be through the United Nations, and that, as we said, cannot be done in this case.
All right. Now, going back to how you described the countermeasures being an illegal action taken to counteract another one. And of course, there is that argument to be made that utilizing these funds will irreversibly change the dynamic and make it so that Russia probably couldn't walk back on some of the decisions it made. But is there an argument to be made that Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the casualty that it incurred is already an action that is irreversible, and hence, again, an argument to be made that even utilizing these funds would be proportionate action?
Well, the question is not whether it is a proportionate action. The question is, so countermeasures need to be proportionate. So you're absolutely right. But countermeasures also need to be temporary and reversible. And the issue here is that utilizing frozen assets would be irreversible in most circumstances. So if you take, for example, Russian gold or whatever, and you liquidate it and use the money to sort of buy weapons for Ukraine or to compensate for damages, that's just simply irreversible. That's still something that Russia has to do. Russia still has the obligation to compensate Ukraine for the damage it has caused through the unlawful invasion, if that makes sense. But it is not for other states to sort of step in and take the decision that now is the time, this is the amount, and this is how the assets are going to be used. All that they can do under international law is to keep putting pressure on Russia to effectively admit the unlawfulness of its act and then compensate Ukraine. They cannot just take the power into their own hands. International law does not allow that, because otherwise you can imagine, I mean, the reason is simple. In this case, it might seem pretty clear that Russia is acting illegally, and most of at least the Western states agree that this is the legal position. But you can imagine circumstances where one state has a dispute with another state and simply decides, oh, the other state acted unlawfully, I'm just going to take all its money in my territory, and I'm now not going to liquidate it and keep it for myself as compensation. That would effectively lead to the complete disorganization and collapse of the international legal order. So the rules are there for a reason. They might not seem very convenient in certain circumstances, like the one that we're talking about. They might even seem unreasonable, but they are there for a reason.
All right. So what can the EU do within the bounds of international law that can further put her to be a Russia's war coffer or make it reverse its action that it's taking right now?
I think in the final analysis, it's not that the measures that the EU has taken are problematic or not enough. So in terms of the law, they have gone pretty far. They could go further and take further measures. But I think the problem, you will realize, is not so much that they haven't taken the appropriate measures, but it is that the member states are probably not applying the measures that the EU has taken with as much care and attention as they probably should have. We already have lots of information about, let's put it this way, peripheral EU states flouting the sanctions one way or another by still accepting Russian oil and gas through intermediaries and so on and so forth. So in reality, is it a question of the law stopping you from taking the measures that you need to take? I don't think that's the case. Or is the reality that there is not enough political will or enough economic space for those measures to be properly applied and for Russia to be properly economically isolated in that sense? I'm afraid it seems that it's probably the latter, and the law is just an easy target in those circumstances where you can say, oh, it's just a law that doesn't allow us to do X, Y, and Z. Well, the law allows you to do quite a few things, but you're not doing them properly, are you?
Right. So the legal framework is in place, but it is the political will that is under scrutiny, and of course, whether or not it could be properly enforced. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers. And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. A new report by Reuters showed that Chinese exports to Russia have seen their steepest decline since February 2025. Imports have also dropped by double-digit figures.
News about the dip in Sino-Russian trade comes on the heels of Vladimir Putin attending a military parade and a special summit in Beijing. Putin took part in talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, during which the leaders discussed, among other issues, trade between the two countries. As it turns out, this trade hasn't been doing all that well compared to previous years. Chinese exports to Russia fell by over 16% year-on-year in August, marking the fifth consecutive monthly contraction. Imports slumped by just shy of 18%, reversing to 4.4% increase from July. Chinese customs have not published a detailed breakdown of the goods and resources traded between Russia and China.
Polish authorities have released Pussy Riot member Antonios Tzanakopoulos from custody. The political activist was detained over the past weekend at the request of Turkmenistan.
The Polish border guard detained Niazova on the basis of an Interpol red notice which was first issued by Turkmenistan in 2002. She is accused by Turkmen authorities of embezzling funds from the country's central bank. Prosecutors considered Niazova's humanitarian residence permit in Lithuania and a 2022 Croatian court ruling in her favor to decide about her release. This was not the first time that she was detained based on the request of Turkmen authorities. In 2011, Switzerland refused to extradite Niazova to Turkmenistan but transferred her to Russia, where she spent 6 years in prison on embezzlement charges. She was also detained by Croatia for 2 days in 2022. Niazova links her persecution by Turkmenistan's authorities to her political views, as her father supported the country's opposition and died in prison. She herself has never held Turkmen citizenship.
Latvia is forcing 841 Russians to leave the country by October. Under amendments to Latvia's migration law, those who fail a language test cannot reside in the country.
Riga is concerned over Russia's historical use of the Russian language as a tool of geopolitical influence. Russian has been used in the past to justify Moscow's aggression against Ukraine, as the Kremlin often claims to be protecting Russian-speaking populations in its propaganda narratives. To ensure that this does not happen to Latvia, the country's authorities have introduced a language test for foreign citizens residing in the country. Russian citizens must also apply for permanent resident status and undergo a security check to be able to legally reside in Latvia. Hundreds are expected to leave the country if they cannot pass the language test, with 841 Russian citizens already being forced to do so by the 13th of October. These changes to migration law were introduced in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.